Hey, this is the 5-Minute Podcast Review for Friday, December 30, 2016, the almost New Year's Eve edition. So many of us are in holiday mode at the moment, and that also includes a few podcasts that are taking a break for a week or two. And if all this means the chance to try out a few new podcasts, then stay listening for the next 5 minutes. I'm going to go through a few podcasts that you might decide to subscribe to, or instead you might just pick off the episodes that catch your interest. And I'll call out a few of those must-listen-to episodes. All links should be on your screen and at the show notes. So, okay, here we go. Well, if you haven't already done it, go and download the latest episode of The Axe Files. That's the interview with outgoing US President Barack Obama. The host, David Axelrod, was the chief strategist for Obama's election campaign and once in office served as special advisor to Obama. Maybe more significantly to the podcast is that the two are also long-term personal friends, and I think this one-hour chat is a great example of the intimacy or the closeness to the real person that podcasts seem to be able to achieve better than any traditional media broadcast. It reminds me of Obama's appearance on the WTF podcast over a year ago, and if you haven't heard that episode, you should check it out also. Obama's recent chat on the Axe Files, however, gained a bit of mainstream media coverage for his suggestion in the podcast that if he'd been able to run again, he'd have beaten Trump. But that's just a small, albeit headline-grabbing moment from what is genuinely an interesting and very insightful one-hour conversation. While you're there, check out other episodes of the Axe Files. It's a fairly politically oriented podcast series given David Axelrod's background and Washington connections, and a lot of the back episodes now seem dated, existing in a world where Trump wasn't seriously expected to be the next US president. But there's still plenty of interesting episodes, interviews with Caroline Kennedy, Mitt Romney, Alastair Campbell, and the New York Times journalist Maureen Dowd, just for example. So that's The Axe Files. Podcast number 2, just called Katie Couric, is in a similar vein. It's also an interview podcast with a bit of a political bent and also with the knack of scratching further below the surface than many mainstream media formats allow. Katie Couric is, of course, well known in the US as a long-time anchor of The Today Show, but perhaps most well known around the world for her interview that virtually destroyed Sarah Palin's chances of becoming vice president. But the episode I want to direct you to is an hour-long one-on-one interview with Edward Snowden. The interview was conducted in Moscow, and it's a rare thing to hear an interview that gets this close to what Edward Snowden is really like. Not just the public political figure, but as a person, how he lives day to day in asylum in Russia, right down to how he pays the rent. If you know of Edward Snowden, but not really a lot about him, listening to this interview is a really efficient and interesting way to come up to speed. That's the Katie Couric podcast, and specifically episode 14 from December 8, her interview with Edward Snowden. Okay, well, if all that's a bit heavy and you want some lighter listening to throw into the mix, check out podcast number 3, which is the Adam Buxton podcast. Adam Buxton is a British comedian, and this is yet another interview podcast, but Adam recognises this right up front in his almost Monty Python-esque opening theme song.
I added one more podcast to the giant podcast bin. Now you have plucked that podcast out and started listening. I took my microphone and found some human folk. Then I recorded all the noises while we spoke. My name is Adam Buxton, I'm a man. I want you to enjoy this, that's the plan.
Well, I refer to that as an almost Monty Python-esque opening theme song because, well, it is, but it also makes a nice segue into the episode I want to direct your attention to, which is episode number 29, an interview with former Python and travel writer Michael Palin, conducted in the comfort of Michael Palin's London club. It's a relaxed and broad-ranging conversation, but still, of course, a good amount of chat about the Monty Python films. And I found Michael Palin to be really quite candid with his thoughts on each of the films. So have a listen to that interview, but also definitely scan the Adam Buxton podcast episode list for other interesting interviews, like the interview with Johnny Greenwood from Radiohead, the Ron Johnson episode, or one of the at least 3 episodes with Louis Theroux. On to podcast number 4, called The Canon. The concept is simple. Each week, film critic hosts Devon Faraci and Amy Nicholson pick a film and debate its worthiness to enter their canon of great films. Sometimes they generally agree, and other times they strongly disagree. And it's particularly interesting if they're arguing over a movie that you have strong feelings about, either positive or negative. In the end, listeners get to vote, and the results are announced at the start of the following episode. So far, they've covered almost 100 films, ranging from The Sound of Music Music and Breakfast at Tiffany's to Reservoir Dogs, Forrest Gump and Saturday Night Fever. So have a listen to the Canon and scroll the episode list to pick off the films you're interested in. And staying with the film theme takes us to podcast number 5 this week, which is actually a bunch of podcasts that are all film commentaries. So if you're familiar with director's commentaries on DVDs, well, it's like that, except the commentaries in this case come in the form of podcasts, which you play in sync with the movie you're watching. Which podcast you go for depends on what mood you're in. They range from the serious, more film buff offerings like Tysto film commentaries through the more irreverent like the Incompetent movie commentary podcast. I put links up to these on your screen along with links to 2 others, Sofa Dogs and the Expositionist commentaries. I'm pretty sure there's a few more out there if you hunt around, but between all these podcasts there's a ton of movies covered, so you should find plenty of commentaries to match up with films you're into. It's a good way to get extra mileage out of those movies you got on your computer or the stack of DVDs you haven't touched for years. And I suppose you could also run these podcasts against movies on Netflix and other streaming services. Well, that is it for this episode and for 2016. I'll see you next week, which will also be next year, with 5 more podcasts. Thanks for listening.